Hello and assalamu alaikum. This is Kashif Kamran, and today I am here to discuss with you the impact of the COVID on audit practices. Now, we know ever since the appearance of COVID on the global scenes somewhere around January 2020, there has been a lot of discussions about the economic implications of COVID, and more importantly, the implication of the audit industry and the implication for the audit practices. Now, the focal of this discussion definitely is on the audit practices, the impact of the COVID on the audit practices, and we would be exploring how COVID has opened new challenges for the audit firms. Now, when we look at the COVID in terms of the impact on the audit practices, and to limit the focus of our discussion, the areas where I believe COVID would be impacting the audit industry, the audit firms for the audits which are already ongoing and the audits which are about to start in the near future is areas like risk assessment and materiality, audit evidence, going concern, subsequent events, written representations, and audit report. And I will be shedding light on each one of them briefly in terms of how the auditors needs to respond and how the auditor needs to react to each of these areas in the event of the implications being caused by the COVID. Now, firstly, when we speak of COVID, we need to understand as accountants, as auditor, that there has been a very significant global impact of the COVID already on the global economy. I was just recently going over a research which was done by the Cambridge study, and they have concluded that they believe there might be an impact of an $82 trillion on the global economy over the next 5 years, and they consider this as the worst case scenario. They have considered in their research paper countries like US, countries like China. They have considered in their research the European Union. They've considered almost every major country in terms of making an assessment of this $82 trillion impact over the next 5 years. But if you look at it from another perspective, in terms of the best case scenario, it is still around 20 to $25 trillion. You look at various financial publications, whether that is from the World Economic Forum or that is from Economist or that is from the Cambridge study, more and less you will find that the estimations are around 20, $25 trillion on the global economy. Now, that is very significant. And we know that most of the global economies have contracted, and most of the global economies are performing at their worst, and they've not seen that since last many years. We have seen the Australian economy going into contraction for the first time in the last 29 years. That is their first recession in the last 29 years as a developed economy. We have seen the Singapore economy performing at their worst since independence. We have seen significant damage to the global economy, whether that is the US, whether that is the China, whether that is the Indian economy, and globally. So the impact is significant, right? And obviously, when we speak of the impact on economy, we are speaking of the impact on the business, on the industry. And being an auditors, we need to audit these industries. We need to audit these businesses. So we need to be skeptical about how this economic impact would be hitting hardly the businesses we are auditing. Moving further, uh, I believe there is a greater need of professional skepticism, and perhaps the need of professional skepticism in the present era has become much more dominating, much more emphasizable than before. There is a need for more heightened professional skepticism by the auditor, and more than before, right? The auditor needs to be really skeptical approaching audits coming up for year ends like June 30th, or the audits which have already started after the year end of March 31st. The auditor needs to be very skeptical about the macro environment affecting the business, the industry, and how that macro environment is really influencing the business and the business profitability, the business liquidity, and the business financial performance. So I believe this global economic meltdown will open lots of questions in the auditor mindset when they are approaching the audit, which have already started and will be starting in the next couple of months. The auditor needs to be more watchful, thoughtful. The auditor needs to exercise more due care, considering the COVID-19 and its impact on the global businesses. The auditor needs to auditor needs to really become thoughtful now. More due care has to come into this process as the auditor approaches the audits which are about to start. Now, when we look at the current scenario where we have become more accustomed to something known as lockdown or restrictions, traveling restrictions, lockdown situations, lots of countries still in full lockdowns or partial lockdowns. A lot of countries have come out of lockdowns and are thinking about going back into lockdowns, considering a second spike or considering a fear factor of a second spike. We might see uncertainties of these lockdowns opening and closing over the next 6 months, over the next 9 months. Uh, that is really, really important for the audit industry. But now we know the auditor needs access to evidence and the auditor needs to travel to locations. Uh, this situation is bringing into account the greater consideration of a scope limitation on audits and the audit report. I will be discussing that in more details later, but I believe this is one of another very important challenge for the audit industry, considering the scope limitations and its impact on not just the audit report, perhaps on the audit evidence. So I think scope limitations will become more and more common in days to come. Rising cases of the COVID positive cases, the rising numbers globally, a fear factor of a second spike coming in US, severe spike coming in the other European countries. So I don't believe that uh, a certain environment will prevail globally. We might see openings and closings. We might see lockdowns and easings of lockdowns as an uncertain parameters or situations coming up in the next 6 months. So a lot of audits will be disturbed. A lot of auditors will face scope limitations for these reasons. Lockdowns and restrictions. There might be traveling restrictions. There might the ease with which we used to move before the COVID came in has changed, right? Now, movement has become more difficult. Restrictions, barriers, lockdowns, rising cases have made things difficult. So the auditor needs to consider all that as well. Revisiting risk assessment and materiality levels. Now we know in the event of the COVID-19 and the global economic meltdown and the economy damaging the business, the auditor needs to be more skeptical about revising risk assessment. The auditor needs to be thorough about risk assessment. The auditor needs to consider the macroeconomic factors in their risk assessment. The auditor needs to consider the downtrend in the businesses in their risk assessment. The auditor needs to consider the increasing trend of the fraud risk factors when they are assessing the risk assessment. The downturns in the economies, the recessions, the downtrends in the business, is that increasing the chance of the management uh, for the management to do more frauds? So auditor needs to think about how this downturn can affect the management mindset and how this downturn can really be considered as a fraud risk factor when they're assessing the risk. Changes in the materiality level, definitely. If you think there is a heightened risk assessment or the risk levels are rising, you need to consider changing your materiality levels. You need to consider revising your materiality levels very differently from the last year when you conducted audits in a scenario when COVID was not there. And now when you're conducting audits when COVID is there, you need to be realistic about changing your materiality levels on a very in a very thorough sense. You might need to take materialities on the normalized profits because there might be some drastic changes in the profit for the year. There might be some companies which must go into losses due to COVID. So you cannot just take materiality on a loss. You cannot just take materiality when there is a drastic change on in profits. You need to think about the normalized profits from the continuing operations. Or you might need to think about taking an average profit of the last many years. Or you might need to take an average profit into account for taking materialities. Or you might need to take the profit of the last year, the normalized profit when COVID was not there. So a lot of judgment has to go in, and we know materiality is all about judgment. So a lot of judgment has to go into this process. We know there are no benchmarks given in ISA 320. We know there are no percentages given in ISA 320. It's all about judgment. We know the benchmarks exist, but that are market practices. So the benchmarks need to be carefully considered. The total assets, the profit before tax or the revenue numbers need to be considered in situations where there have been drastic changes in revenue, drastic changes in profit. So in drastic changes, we need to refer back to the normalized revenues or normalized profits, taking materialities. The challenges in gathering evidence, which I just discussed upon, there might be challenges like limitations, lockdowns, free movement of the auditor, free access of the auditors. There might be situations where you cannot go down to the warehouses, etc. Non-availability of employees due to restrictions or COVID positive cases. You might not get 100% attendance, right? There might be people working from home. There might be people with positive cases. There might be people who have a fear factor of traveling to the offices. So you might not believe that there are all employees available to the auditor in one given scenario. So evidence being gathered more virtually, evidence being gathered through more online meetings or through more virtual conferences, increase use of gathering evidence from meetings through GoToWebinar or WebEx or the Google Meet or something like that coming more common. Inventory counts, access to warehouse can be difficult. The warehouse can be in an area which is under lockdown or can be in an area where there are more COVID cases and there is a fear factor or there is a difficult restrictions to travel to that warehouse. So I think auditor will face challenges in the way the evidence is gathered, gathering more virtual evidence, online meetings, communication with management will become more online, perhaps because you might not find the physical presence of the staff. Most of the staff might be working from home. Work from home will become more common practices, will eventually be having an impact on the audit practices. Risk assess, going concern, cautious assessment. Going concern will become much more important now with the global economy melting down, countries going into recessions, the countries being badly affected. We need to be more careful about its impact on business, and the business are being badly affected. We have already seen so many businesses filing for bankruptcy. We've seen a couple of airlines globally which has already been in the process of filing for liquidations. We have seen lots of brands filing for bankruptcy in the recent past, particularly in US and Europe. So the economic fall down has to be considered as a trigger point here for the foreseeable future, the business foreseeable future. And the liquidity issues rising for businesses, the economic crunch making business difficult, uh, the demand is going down, the sales are going down, the consumers have become more concerned of spending money in more cautious areas, or the spendings by consumer has gone down in event of risk and keeping more money for health or for medical supplies rather than keeping money for luxuries. So I think the buying patterns of consumer would also be impacting upon uh, the demand, and you might see the rising levels of inventory in the warehouse. You might see rising levels of inventory holding period for the companies. You might even see receivables rising. You might even see the provision for doubtful debts going up for the business. So in all that, the working capital of the business might get badly affected. Rise of material uncertainties, which I just discussed with you. So we believe this is an area of concern for auditor, that when you go to the audit, you might see rising number of material uncertainties and rising number of events which results into uncertainties for the foreseeable future. So the auditor needs to be very watchful, very skeptical of how events unfolding in recent past and in recent future will be having impact on the business scalability or on business continuity, which will become a very big question mark. Need to be more skeptical, obvious. So I think going concern will become one more important area. And this is a very severe economic crisis, one of a very severe one in the recent man history. So probably the auditor needs to be more watchful and more cautious about assessing the going concern and its disclosures in the financial statement and its impact on the audit report later. Subsequent events on the financial statements, adjusting events and non-adjusting event. I think IS 10 will become very important. Now, there might be many companies in the world which had an year end of 31st of December 2018, or rather 2019, just to make that correction, 2019. There might be many companies with the year end December 31st, 2019, when perhaps the COVID was not officially reported. And for them, the auditor must have started the audit. And while they were in the audit, I think somewhere in January 2020, it was officially disclosed the COVID at the global arena, right? So the 31st December 2019 audits needs to consider COVID in context of a subsequent event and its impact on the financial statement, either in terms of an adjusting event or a non-adjusting event. So I think the auditors who are performing audit for 31st of December 2019 are in more greater challenge of considering IAS 10 and in a more greater challenge of utilizing IAS 10 in a more perfect manner. But for the other auditors who are performing audit for March 31st, 2020, by that time, COVID was known. By that time, COVID was there. So probably the impact of the COVID must have started to come into the financial statements for March 31st, 2020. So the challenge of the subsequent events will only be on the auditor who was auditing the financial statements for 31st of December 2019, because the COVID was known after. And then again, the companies which will be having audit on the 30th of June 2020, they Uh, by that time, obviously, the situation of COVID must have become more alarming and more burning. But I think the challenge for subsequent events, the challenge for IS-10, perhaps will only be for the companies at the number one position, 31st of December 2019. And that's the point where they need to consider how to account for the COVID, because it was officially disclosed and known to the global audience in January 2020. But companies closing in 2020 uh, must have already taken the impact, or already the impact would have come in. But still, the challenge for IS10 remains open, because there are lots of events which might be happening after 31st of March. There might be lots of events happening after June 30th, which needs to be incorporated either as adjusting or non-adjusting. So I think there has to be a more skeptical mindset on IS 10, because dramatic changes are coming in every day, every week. So there might be situations where your customer might be liquidating because of the COVID after the balance sheet date, or there might be any fall in the inventory prices after the year end just because of the COVID. More drastic fall in the inventory prices, more drastic fall in the demand of the inventory. So a lot of events have to be considered more skeptically and more seriously in terms of subsequent events. Need of representation, I believe, will become more greater, because if we believe that considering there will be a rise in uncertainties surrounding the business environment, and as the rise in uncertainty surrounding the business environment goes up, there will be a greater need of the representations. So, because the uncertainties will arise, uncertainties in use of estimates, uncertainties in impairments, in fair values, in provisions, in inventory valuations, uncertainties in going concern. So, I think there would be a greater need of taking representations than before. Lack of evidence also, because auditor will not be having the evidence in a very proper manner. So again, that restrictions would also encourage the use of representations. So I think there would be a greater role of representation than before, the greater role of ISA 580 than before, and a greater application of ISA 580 than before. Impacts on the audit reports, finally. I foresee that the impacts on the audit reports will be in the areas of scope limitations, as we have already discussed. Scope limitations will increase the impact in terms of ISA 705, more about qualified opinions coming in due to COVID restrictions, and COVID restrictions making it difficult for the auditor to access evidence. I believe ISA 705 would become really, really important. Uh, the paragraph on material uncertainty relating to going concern will become important, as we see more rise of material uncertainty relating to going concern. The adding of the paragraph, the adding of the paragraph relating to material uncertainties in the audit report will become more and more obvious, because more and more business will be having material uncertainties relating to going concern, and this paragraph will be more greatly used for audits across 2020 and 2021 till the time the business environment becomes somewhat better. But currently this year, the early next year, things looks problematic. Greater use of emphasis of a meta paragraph. There might be lots of important disclosures coming into the financial statements, where emphasis of a meta paragraph will become really important. The greater use of ISA 706, particularly disclosures relating to non-adjusting events, might arise. Disclosures relating to any contingencies might arise a lot, and there might be a greater new use of emphasis of a meta paragraph in the audit report. Extended key audit matters in ISA 701, sorry, not 705. Extended use of key audit matters in ISA 701, like impairments, provisions, layoff of employees. There might be so many key audit matters now when we go to the audit under COVID. For March 31st, 2020, June 30th, 2020, there might be so many key audit matters to consider under COVID. There might be impairments becoming more obvious, provisions becoming more obvious, employees redundancies, employees terminations becoming more obvious, and there might be many, many more matters which might be one-off, significant, which needs to be considered under extended key audit matter discussion under ISA 701. So there will be a significant impact of COVID on the audit report, significant impact of COVID on risk assessment, on materiality levels, on going concern, on audit evidence, on subsequent events. So the audit industry is preparing for it, right? There are series and series of guidance and trainings coming from the regulators, from ICAW, from ICAP, from ACCA, preparing future accountants, auditors. Industry experts are holding discussions globally on how things will impact. IAASP, IFAC uh, are all bringing materials to help auditor at this point in time. Even the audit firms, the PricewaterhouseCoopers, the E&Y, the KPMG, have already put publications on their websites about how COVID will impact the financial statement, how COVID will impact the audit. So there is lots of guidance on this. So as you need to have an open mindset, and you need to think realistically of how COVID is impacting the future of the audit industry and the financial statement. So that is it. For the presentation on COVID and its impact on the audit report. I hope you liked it, and we'll be looking forward to your feedback. And I hope this presentation will open your mindset for further research over the internet in terms of the impact on the audit practices. Have a nice day. Goodbye.